A lonely lady opened the door on a stormy night and found an abandoned pregnant dog that no one wanted. When the puppies were born, she burst into emotional tears. Secrets came to light, and their lives changed forever in ways no one could have predicted. A story of overcoming, rebirth, and purpose. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and comment from where you're watching. The biting winter wind whipped through the deserted streets of Willow Creek, a small town nestled in the Ozark Mountains, as a tiny, shivering body huddled amongst soggy cardboard boxes in a narrow alley. The little dog, its eyes dull with resignation and neglect, lay curled up, too weak to fight the cold that seeped into its very bones. Its matted, dirty fur offered little protection, and each painful breath formed small puffs of vapor that quickly dissipated in the frigid air. It had been abandoned weeks ago, after years of faithful service to a family that simply left it behind when they moved. Now, exhausted and hungry, it finally surrendered. Then, slow, steady footsteps echoed in the alley. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, an elderly woman with silver hair carrying grocery bags and walking with difficulty due to arthritis in her knees, stopped when she saw the small, motionless form. She approached cautiously, her keen eyes behind her old-fashioned glasses catching the faint movement of the animal's breath. Without hesitation, she set her bags down on the damp ground and removed her own shawl, the only thing she had to ward off the harsh winter, and gently wrapped the shivering dog. "You're not giving up tonight," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion as she hugged the animal close to her chest. "We've both faced too many lonely days." Thus began an unexpected journey. Mrs. Vance, newly arrived in Willow Creek after selling the house where she had lived for 40 years with her husband, who had passed away 3 winters ago, had moved into a small apartment to be closer to her only daughter, Sarah. But Sarah was always busy with her own life, and the promised visits became increasingly rare, leaving Mrs. Vance immersed in the loneliness of an unfamiliar place, without friends or acquaintances. The apartment building didn't allow pets, the first small hurdle, but she, who had always respected the rules all her life, decided that some rules simply weren't as important as saving a life. With quiet determination, she hid the dog under her shawl and slipped into the building, avoiding the superintendent, Mr. Fitzwilliam, who always eyed her with suspicion. Mrs. Vance's apartment was small but cozy. The walls were adorned with old photographs in wooden frames, memories of a lifetime spent with her husband, of the trips they took together, of her daughter at various ages. An old grandfather clock, a family heirloom, rhythmically marked the passage of time, as if reminding her that even in moments of solitude, life continued its inexorable course. With careful movements, she prepared a little corner for the dog in the bathroom, using old towels to improvise a bed. She warmed some milk and offered it to the animal, which could barely lift its head to drink. Its eyes, once resigned, now held a faint glimmer of gratitude. That night was long. Mrs. Vance slept sitting on the bathroom floor, leaning against the bathtub, afraid the dog wouldn't survive until dawn. Every hour she checked its breathing, adjusted the shawl covering it, whispered words of encouragement. Her own aches, in her knees, back, and lonely heart, seemed insignificant compared to that fragile life struggling to continue. When the first rays of sun peeked through the cracks in the window, illuminating the small bathroom, Mrs. Vance realized that both she and the dog had survived the night. It was just the first day of many, but it already represented a victory. With a tired smile, she gently stroked the animal's head. "We'll get through this, you'll see," she promised, as she slowly got up and prepared to face the challenges ahead. And so, in that apartment where only silence and loneliness had reigned before, an unlikely friendship was born that would forever change the course of 2 lives that had lost their way. In the following weeks, Mrs. Vance transformed her routine to care for the weakened animal. The town veterinarian, moved by the story, agreed to treat it outside his regular hours and established a recovery plan that would require a lot of patience, the second small hurdle. The diagnosis revealed that, in addition to severe malnutrition, the dog had a chronic illness that would require constant medication. "He has a heart condition, Mrs. Vance," explained Dr. Ramirez as he put away his instruments. "He'll need special care and medication for the rest of his life." "How long does he have?" she asked, gently stroking the animal's ears, which trembled slightly on the examination table. The veterinarian smiled kindly. "It's not a question of how long, but of quality of life. With proper care, he can live well for many years." Mrs. Vance's modest pension barely covered her own needs, and the medication was expensive, the first medium hurdle. To earn extra money, she began knitting hats and scarves to sell at the local farmer's market, using leftover yarn she had been saving for years in a keepsake box. Her fingers, worn by time, ached after hours of work, but each item sold meant another week of medicine. Her apartment transformed into a small workshop. In the corner of the living room, the old armchair where she used to read was now surrounded by colorful yarn balls. The kitchen table became her workbench. At night, while the dog slept in its makeshift bed near the space heater, Mrs. Vance worked under the yellowish light of a lamp, her glasses perched on her nose, the knitting needles moving with the precision that only decades of practice could provide. The days followed their own rhythm. In the morning, she administered the dog's medication and prepared a special gruel the veterinarian had recommended. Then she went for a short walk, hiding him inside a large bag, a trick she had developed to avoid being seen by the superintendent. In the nearby park, she let him feel the grass under his paws, always watchful that he didn't overexert himself. It was during one of these furtive outings that Mrs. Vance first noticed a change in the animal's gaze. They were sitting on a secluded bench under the shade of an old oak tree when the dog lifted its head and looked at her with eyes that were no longer dull with resignation, but bright and attentive. It was as if, at that moment, it truly saw her, not just as the person who fed and medicated it, but as someone who had chosen to share her loneliness with it. The first major event came when the dog, whom she affectionately called Buddy, avoiding giving it a specific name, as if fearing definitive attachment, finally managed to stand on its own after 3 weeks of intensive care. That night, while knitting beside the small heater, she felt something touch her leg. It was the dog's wet nose, seeking contact for the first time. "Hello there," she murmured, surprised and moved by the gesture. "You decided it's worth trusting me?" In response, the animal rested its head on her knee and closed its eyes, in a display of trust that made her swallow hard to hold back tears. Since her husband's passing, Mrs. Vance hadn't felt the gentle weight of another living being's trust upon her. There was something deeply comforting in that simple gesture. Spring arrived, bringing with it the awakening of nature and with it the second major event. During a furtive walk through the town gardens, an elderly gentleman walking his dog noticed the special bond between Mrs. Vance and her Buddy. A casual conversation revealed that he was Mr. Hawthorne, a retired dog trainer who knew Mr. Fitzwilliam, the superintendent, the second medium hurdle. He offered help to regularize the animal's situation, using his influence to obtain an exception to the rules. "I've known Fitzwilliam since we were kids," confided Mr. Hawthorne, a tall, thin man with neatly combed white hair. "He makes a lot of noise, but deep down he's a softie. Let me talk to him." Mrs. Vance hesitated. "I don't want to cause trouble for anyone." "What trouble? A little dog like this, quiet, well cared for. The trouble would be leaving him on the street," he argued, observing the small dog who was now visibly stronger, though still clearly a survivor. What neither of them could foresee is that this budding friendship would bring to light a third medium hurdle. Mr. Hawthorne had been a widower for 5 years, and like her faced the silent loneliness that only those who have experienced it understand. Their meetings to discuss the dog's well-being gradually transformed into walks in the park, conversations about old books, and shared memories of a time the younger generation didn't know. There was an ease in each other's company that Mrs. Vance hadn't experienced in a long time. Mr. Hawthorne had a gift for listening, truly listening, without interrupting or judging. When she talked about her husband, about the longing she felt, about the little things she missed in her daily life, he understood on a level that only someone who had loved and lost could comprehend. On their morning walks, now no longer furtive thanks to Mr. Hawthorne's intervention with the superintendent, they developed small rituals: coffee at the corner bakery on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a stop at the park gazebo to listen to the birds on Saturdays, a visit to the farmer's market on Sundays, where Mrs. Vance sold her knitted items. The dog, who responded more and more to the affectionate Buddy, accompanied them on all these outings, like a silent guardian of the friendship that was blossoming. His health improved every day, although the veterinarian had made it clear that he would always be a fragile animal, needing continuous care. It was on one of those spring mornings, while watching children play in the park, that Mr. Hawthorne asked an unexpected question: "Why haven't you given him a real name?" Mrs. Vance was silent for a moment, her fingers automatically stroking the ears of the dog who was dozing beside her on the bench. "I think I'm afraid," she finally admitted. "Afraid of what?" "Of becoming completely attached, of losing again." Mr. Hawthorne nodded, understanding without the need for further explanation. The fear of loss was something they both lived with daily. "Sometimes," he said after a long silence, "protecting our hearts means also depriving them of new joys." The words hung in the air between them, a simple truth that Mrs. Vance had always known, but only now, sitting on that park bench next to a new friend and a nameless dog, could she truly understand. When summer arrived, it brought with it the third small hurdle. Sarah, Mrs. Vance's daughter, announced that she would have to move to another state for work, taking her grandchildren with her, whom the grandmother rarely saw. The news fell like a weight on her already fragile heart. That night, for the first time since she had saved the dog, she cried openly, sitting in her old armchair. The animal, now recovered and full of life, sat beside her and rested its head on her lap, as if understanding her pain. "What will become of us now, Buddy?" she whispered, wiping away her tears with the embroidered handkerchief she always carried in her pocket. "I moved here to be near her, and now I'll be alone again." The phone rang, breaking the silence of the apartment. It was Mr. Hawthorne, as if he had sensed something was wrong. "Mrs. Vance, sorry to call so late, but I had a feeling. Is everything all right?" The deep, kind voice on the other end of the line brought back the tears with renewed force. Through sobs, Mrs. Vance told him about her daughter's imminent departure, about the feeling of emptiness the news had brought, about the question that kept echoing in her mind. Why stay there? "May I come see you?" "It's not good to be alone when we're sad," he offered. Minutes later, a gentle knock on the door announced his arrival. Mr. Hawthorne brought a small bouquet of daisies from his garden and an expression of genuine concern. The dog, recognizing a friend, greeted him with an enthusiastic wag of its tail. Sitting in the small living room with cups of chamomile tea in their hands, they talked until late into the night, not only about Sarah and her departure, but about the many farewells they had both faced throughout their lives. There was something liberating in sharing those stories, as if each word spoken eased some of the weight accumulated over years of silence. It was during that conversation that Mr. Hawthorne first mentioned Willow Creek Farm, his old rural property. "You know, when Carmela, my wife, passed away, I couldn't stay there anymore. There were memories in every corner, in every tree we planted together. So I rented the place to a young couple and came to town, thinking it would be easier to start over among strangers," he explained, his eyes fixed on the window, as if he could see the farm through the darkness of the night. "But the truth is, I brought all the memories with me. You can't run away from what's inside us." Mrs. Vance nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She too had tried to leave her memories behind when she sold the house where she had lived with her husband, but the memories, both sweet and bitter, had moved with her, occupying space in the drawers of her mind and in the corners of her heart. "You never told me about that farm before," she commented, curious. A nostalgic smile lit up Mr. Hawthorne's wrinkled face. "It's a special place. 5 acres of good land, with a creek running through the property, an orchard that Carmela planted with so much love, a simple but cozy house. It was our little piece of paradise." For the next few hours, he described Willow Creek Farm in such vivid detail that Mrs. Vance could almost smell the flowers, hear the murmur of the creek, visualize the guava trees laden with fruit. In her mind, she formed the image of a place where time seemed to run at a different pace, gentler, more in tune with the natural cycles of life. It was past midnight when Mr. Hawthorne finally said goodbye, promising to return the next day to accompany her on a visit to Sarah. The dog followed him to the door, as if wanting to make sure he would really come back. "He's very fond of you," observed Mrs. Vance, moved by the little animal's loyalty. "The feeling is mutual," replied Mr. Hawthorne, bending down to pet the dog's head. "You know, he really needs a name, something that reflects who he is, not just his function of keeping company." The words continued to resonate in Mrs. Vance's mind long after Mr. Hawthorne had left. A name meant recognition, acceptance, commitment. It meant admitting that this small being had become an integral part of her life. The next morning, while making coffee, she watched the dog lying on the living room cushion, illuminated by a ray of sun coming through the window. Its fur, once dull and matted, now shone with health, despite the visible scars of its past life. "You're like a miracle," she whispered, moved by the transformation. My little miracle. And so, almost without realizing it, Mrs. Vance gave the dog its real name, Miracle. It was fitting for a being that had survived against all odds, and in the process, had brought new life to her lonely heart. The visit to Sarah that afternoon was difficult, but Mr. Hawthorne's comforting presence made everything easier. Sarah, always practical and somewhat distant, was visibly surprised to see her mother accompanied. "I didn't know you'd made friends here, Mom," she commented, as she served coffee in the living room filled with moving boxes. "There are many things about my life that you don't know, dear," Mrs. Vance replied softly. There was no resentment in her words, only the confirmation of a truth they both knew but rarely acknowledged. Over the years, they had become strangely familiar, united by blood but separated by choices and circumstances. It was then that the first major hurdle occurred. A letter arrived, informing that the old rural property where Mrs. Vance had lived with her husband, and which had been sold for her move, was again for sale at a price far below market value due to financial problems of the new owners. Mr. Hawthorne, upon hearing the news, suggested something that seemed absurd. "What if we go back? You to your house and I to help you get it back. That place always had enough space for people and animals to start over." The proposal brought deep fears to the surface in Mrs. Vance. The fear of another abandonment, of reliving painful memories, of risking her meager savings. But it also awakened something that had been dormant for a long time: hope. The third important event was her decision to face her fear and accept the challenge. That night after the visit to Sarah, Mrs. Vance couldn't sleep. The idea of returning to the old house made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. Sitting in the darkness of the living room, with only the moonlight coming through the window, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to return to her roots, now accompanied by Miracle and with Mr. Hawthorne's friendship as support. The property, affectionately called Heaven's Corner by her husband, was a small ranch 2 hours from Willow Creek. They had bought the land when they were newlyweds, building the house little by little, planting each tree with their own hands, watching everything grow along with their love. It was there that they raised Sarah, where they spent the best years of their lives, where they grew old together, until illness took her partner of decades. After her husband's death, the house and land became too heavy a burden to carry alone. Every corner held memories that, at that time of recent grief, seemed more painful than comforting. The decision to sell and move to Willow Creek, to be close to her daughter, seemed sensible then. But now, looking back, Mrs. Vance realized that perhaps she had acted out of fear, not wisdom. "What do you think, Miracle?" she asked the dog who was sleeping peacefully at her feet. "Is it time to go home?" As if it had understood every word, Miracle lifted its head and looked at her with its intelligent eyes, now full of life and trust. A small bark, the first that Mrs. Vance had heard since finding him in that alley, sounded like an affirmative answer. With a smile, she made her decision. Tomorrow she would talk to Mr. Hawthorne about the next steps. It was time to close a cycle and at the same time begin a new chapter of her life, not running away from memories, but embracing them as part of who she was. Autumn had already painted the leaves gold when Mrs. Vance, Mr. Hawthorne, and Miracle arrived at the old property, now abandoned and weathered by time. The garden, once flourishing, was overgrown with weeds, the paint peeling, the windows fogged. To any observer, it would just be an old house in ruins. To her, it was the setting where she had lived the best moments of her life. Mrs. Vance stopped at the foot of the dirt road leading to the house, feeling her heart quicken. Even in its state of neglect, Heaven's Corner was still there, waiting for her. The trees she had planted with her husband, now taller and more lush, seemed to welcome her with the gentle swaying of their branches in the autumn breeze. "Are you ready?" asked Mr. Hawthorne, offering her his arm for support. She nodded, unable to speak because of the lump in her throat. Miracle, sensing her emotion, came close and pressed its nose against her hand, as if to say, "I'm here." Together, the three of them walked the path to the porch. Every step awakened memories. The flower bed where she had planted her first roses, the mango tree under which they used to sit on hot summer afternoons, the wooden swing her husband had made for Sarah when she was still little. The key still fit perfectly in the lock, although it took some effort to turn it. When the door finally opened, the familiar scent of old wood and damp earth filled her nostrils, instantly transporting her to the past. "Welcome back," whispered Mr. Hawthorne, gently squeezing her shoulder. The rooms were empty except for some furniture covered with dusty sheets. Mrs. Vance had sold most of her belongings when she moved, keeping only a few sentimental items that now decorated her small apartment in Willow Creek. Miracle ran from room to room, sniffing every corner, exploring this new environment with enthusiasm. "He seems to approve of the place," commented Mr. Hawthorne with a smile, watching the dog. "He feels it's home," replied Mrs. Vance, allowing herself to smile too. "Even with all the work we have ahead of us, this is still home." And there was no shortage of work. The fourth medium hurdle came when they discovered that the house was much more damaged internally than it appeared. The roof had serious leaks, the electrical system needed to be completely renovated, and autumn was rapidly advancing, with winter just around the corner. Their savings wouldn't be enough for all the necessary repairs. Sitting on the porch with cups of coffee they had brought in a thermos, they discussed their options. The sky was painted with intense colors at sunset, creating a spectacle that contrasted with the seriousness of the conversation. "We could start with the essentials," suggested Mr. Hawthorne, always practical. "The roof first, then the electricity. The rest can wait." "Even so, the costs will be high," worried Mrs. Vance. "And we still have to think about Miracle's medicine." As if understanding that they were talking about him, the dog approached, resting its head on Mrs. Vance's lap. In the months since she had found him, his health had improved considerably, but the veterinarian had made it clear that the heart problem would require constant medication. "One thing at a time," said Mr. Hawthorne, with the serenity that comes from experience. "Tomorrow we'll take a good look at everything and make a plan. This house has already weathered many storms. It will withstand a few more until we can fix it." They spent the night at the small hotel in the neighboring town just a few miles away. The next day at dawn, they returned to the property equipped with basic tools and determination. During the morning, they worked together checking the condition of the house, making lists of necessary materials, prioritizing the most urgent repairs. It was during this inspection that Miracle, exploring the grounds while the elderly couple assessed the damage, began to dig insistently in a corner of the garden near an old guava tree. Mr. Hawthorne, curious, helped to dig and found a small metal box. Inside, Mrs. Vance's husband had saved his years of savings, money she didn't even know existed. "Humberto always saved a little each month," she murmured, astonished, looking at the considerable amount that lay inside the box. "He said it was for an emergency. It seems Mr. Humberto is still looking out for you even after he's gone," observed Mr. Hawthorne kindly. Silent tears rolled down Mrs. Vance's wrinkled face. It seemed like a sign, a blessing from beyond, as if her husband was giving his approval for this new beginning. With the money found, the most urgent repairs could be made without compromising their small reserves. But it wasn't just money they found in those first few days. As they worked on the property, other treasures emerged. A box of carefully labeled seeds in the old tool shed, well-preserved tools protected by tarps, a notebook with detailed notes on the planting and harvesting of various crops, knowledge accumulated by Humberto over decades. The second major hurdle occurred when the local community, upon learning of the former neighbor's return, organized a work party to help renovate the house. Many remembered her fondly for the cake she shared at community celebrations, for the kindness with which she treated everyone. In a few weeks, what seemed impossible began to take shape. The house was reborn, as were its inhabitants. It was moving to see the generosity of the neighbors, some old acquaintances, others newcomers who had never met Mrs. Vance. Mr. Davis, the retired carpenter, dedicated days to restoring the windows and doors. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the town bakery, appeared every morning with freshly baked bread and coffee for the workers. Even the children from the local school came one Saturday, under the guidance of their teacher, to help clean the garden and plant new flowers. Miracle became the unofficial mascot of the group, running among the workers, receiving pats and treats, barking enthusiastically when someone new arrived. It was hard to believe that this lively and sociable animal was the same one Mrs. Vance had found dying in that alley. "It's as if he was born for this place," commented Mr. Hawthorne one afternoon, as they both watched the dog chase butterflies among the freshly pruned bushes. "He was reborn for it," replied Mrs. Vance with a smile, "just like me." Life on the rural property established a new rhythm, marked by the seasons, by the care of the orchard that bloomed again, by the daily walks with Miracle, who now ran freely through the fields. Mrs. Vance, Mr. Hawthorne, and the dog formed an unlikely family, united not by blood ties but by daily decisions to stay together, to build something new from the ruins of the past. Winter had given way to an exuberant spring. The house, now completely restored, shone under the April sun with its new white paint and polished wooden windows. The garden, once choked by weeds, proudly displayed its rose bushes, dahlias and lilies. In the orchard, the rows of vegetables promised a bountiful harvest, and the fruit trees were beginning to bloom, heralding fruit for the summer. Mrs. Vance felt more alive than she had in many years. Every morning she woke to the singing of birds, made coffee, and went out to the veranda to contemplate her recovered little paradise. Often, Mr. Hawthorne joined her, bringing freshly baked bread from his morning visit to town. They had fallen into a comfortable routine that neither dared to name, but which they both silently cherished. Miracle had thrived in this environment. His heart condition remained stable thanks to regular medication, and his energy seemed inexhaustible. He had become a faithful guardian of the property, alerting with barks to the arrival of any visitor, although always with a wagging tail that belied any ferocity. It was precisely his enthusiastic barking that announced the arrival of a car that April morning. Mr. Hawthorne, who was helping Mrs. Vance plant new seeds in the orchard, straightened up curiously. "Were you expecting visitors?" She shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron. Together they walked towards the front of the house, with Miracle running ahead, still barking, but clearly more excited than alarmed. The car that pulled up in front of the house was a compact model, a rental judging by the decals. From it descended a familiar figure that Mrs. Vance hadn't expected to see: Sarah, her daughter, accompanied by her two teenage children, Ethan and Olivia. "Mom!" exclaimed Sarah, hurrying down the gravel path. She paused for a moment, staring in amazement at the transformation of the property. This is incredible." The reunion was warm, but also charged with a slight tension. It had been almost 6 months since Sarah had moved, and although they talked on the phone occasionally, it was the first time she had visited the ranch since Mrs. Vance had returned. The grandchildren, now taller and more mature than she remembered, seemed shy, as if they didn't know how to behave with this renewed grandmother who lived in a place so different from the small apartment where they had visited her before. "Miracle, easy," Mrs. Vance called to the dog, who was now jumping around the newcomers, especially interested in the teenagers. "He doesn't bite. He just wants to play." "Miracle?" Sarah asked in surprise. "You have a dog? I thought the building didn't allow pets." "I don't live in the building anymore, honey," Mrs. Vance replied with a smile, "and there's a lot more that's changed." She introduced Mr. Hawthorne, simply explaining that he was a good friend and neighbor who had helped her with the restoration of the ranch. Sarah shook his hand with an appraising look that Mrs. Vance knew well. Her daughter had always been protective, sometimes to the point of intrusiveness, while Mr. Hawthorne, always diplomatic, offered to show the teenagers the neighbors' horses. Mrs. Vance and Sarah sat on the veranda with cups of freshly brewed coffee. "Why didn't you tell me you were planning to buy the ranch back?" Sarah asked directly, once they were alone. Mrs. Vance sighed. She had been expecting this conversation, but not so soon. "It wasn't exactly planned, honey. The opportunity arose, and I decided to take it. But how could you afford it? And all these renovations?" Patiently, Mrs. Vance told her about finding the money hidden by her father, omitting the detail that it had been Miracle who had discovered it. She talked about the community's support, about how the restoration project had given new life not only to the house but to herself. "Besides," she added softly, "here I feel connected to your father. Not in a sad way, but a comforting one." Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes scanning the flourishing garden, the restored house, her mother's calm face. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different, less assured. "I always thought you sold this place because it brought you bad memories. That moving to Willow Creek was what you really wanted." "It was what I thought I wanted," corrected Mrs. Vance. "Sometimes fear makes us make decisions that we confuse with desires." The conversation was interrupted by the return of Mr. Hawthorne with the teenagers, both visibly more cheerful. Olivia was carrying wildflowers picked during the walk, and Ethan was talking enthusiastically about the horses and the promise that he could ride one the next day if his mother allowed it. The visit, initially scheduled for just one day, was extended when Sarah announced during dinner that they had to talk about something important. The children were sent to explore the collection of old books in the living room, while the adults remained at the table. "I lost my job," Sarah confessed without preamble. "The company is cutting staff, and I was one of the last ones in. I've been looking for something new for weeks, but the situation is difficult." This revelation constituted the third major hurdle. Sarah explained that her apartment was too expensive to maintain without a steady income, and that she was considering moving in temporarily with a friend while she stabilized. The kids would have to stay in a very small space, sharing a room, and probably change schools, she explained, the worry evident in her voice. Mrs. Vance and Mr. Hawthorne exchanged glances. No words were needed. They both knew what they were thinking. "What if they stay here?" Mrs. Vance suggested, taking her daughter's hand. "The ranch has plenty of space. The kids could help with the orchard, have their own space, be in touch with nature." "Mom, I don't want to be a burden to you at this stage." "It wouldn't be a burden," Mr. Hawthorne interjected gently. "It would be a blessing to have a whole family here. And while you're looking for work, you could help with the project we've been planning." The project he was referring to was the conversion of part of the ranch into a small nursery of native and medicinal plants, something they had discussed as a way to generate additional income. Sarah looked alternately at her mother and Mr. Hawthorne, surprise clear on her face. "You two have been planning a business?" "Let's just say we have a lot of plans," Mrs. Vance replied with a serene smile. "And they all include a future where we not only survive but flourish." That night, with Sarah's promise to seriously consider the proposal, Mrs. Vance sat on the porch under the stars, with Miracle dozing at her feet. Mr. Hawthorne joined her silently, his presence as natural as the air they breathed. "Do you think it will work?" she asked after a while. "All of us together here?" "If there's love and respect, there's always a way," he replied simply. "Besides, this land was always meant for a family. Maybe it's time for it to be one again." Mrs. Vance nodded, her eyes fixed on the crescent moon, softly illuminating the ranch's contours. In her mind, the memories of the past and the possibilities of the future intertwined, like the threads of those shawls she used to knit, creating a new and beautiful pattern that she was only beginning to glimpse. Sarah's decision to temporarily move to the ranch with her children brought a series of adjustments for everyone. The house, though spacious, had to be reorganized to accommodate the new residents. The room that had been Humberto's study became Ethan's bedroom, while the small room next to the kitchen, which Mrs. Vance had used to store her knitting supplies, became Olivia's space. The first few days were a cautious dance of personalities and routines. Sarah, accustomed to the structured life of the city, sometimes found herself lost in the slower pace of the countryside. The teenagers, initially reluctant to the lack of high-speed internet and urban entertainment, gradually discovered the simple pleasures the ranch offered. Climbing trees, helping in the orchard, exploring the creek, chasing Miracle through the fields. Mr. Hawthorne became a constant but discreet presence, arriving each morning from his small house in the neighboring town, always bringing something useful, new seeds, tools, town news, or simply his inexhaustible willingness to help. For the children, he quickly became a figure of respect and affection, especially for Ethan, who found in him someone willing to listen to his teenage concerns without judgment. One afternoon, while Mrs. Vance was preparing dinner, she heard laughter coming from the backyard. Peeking out the window, she saw Olivia trying to teach Mr. Hawthorne how to use her cell phone to take selfies, while Miracle jumped between them, determined to appear in every photo. "Look, Mr. Hawthorne, you have to hold it like this and press here," the teenager explained with the exaggerated patience of someone instructing someone in basic technology. "Ah, I understand, but this little gadget is more slippery than a newborn calf," he replied, provoking more laughter when the phone almost fell from his hands. The scene filled Mrs. Vance's heart with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Her family, once fragmented by distance and circumstances, seemed to be finding a new balance, weaving connections that went beyond blood. The fourth significant event came in the form of a phone call. Sarah had been tirelessly sending job applications and finally received an offer, not the executive position she had held before, but something completely different. A school in the neighboring town urgently needed a math teacher. "I don't know if I should accept it," she confessed to her mother that night, after the children had gone to bed. "It's much less money than I earned before, and it's been years since I've taught." "The question isn't whether you should accept it," Mrs. Vance replied as she knitted what appeared to be a scarf. "The question is whether you want to do it. Sarah was silent, considering the question. I always liked teaching. Before entering the corporate world, I dreamed of being a teacher. But then came the kids, the mortgage, the expectations. It seemed more sensible to follow the money route. Sometimes life takes detours to bring us exactly where we should be, Mrs. Vance commented softly. Look at me. Sarah's decision to accept the position marked a turning point. With a stable, albeit modest job, she could contribute to the ranch's expenses while continuing to live there with her children. The idea of a temporary stay began to transform into something more permanent. It was also during this period that the nursery project began to take concrete form. Mr. Hawthorne had contacted an old friend who was an expert in medicinal plants, who provided them with valuable advice and contacts. Mrs. Vance dusted off her husband's notebooks, discovering detailed notes on native plants that had grown in the region for generations. Ethan, to everyone's surprise, showed a particular interest in this project. At 15, he had begun to worry about environmental issues, and the idea of a nursery that preserved local species resonated with him. He spent hours helping Mr. Hawthorne prepare the planting beds, absorbing knowledge about plant propagation like a sponge. We could have a website, he suggested one day during dinner, to sell plants to people in the city who are looking for native species. Olivia could take the photos, I could manage the website, Mom the accounts, and your grandmother and I would be the cheap labor, huh? Joked Mr. Hawthorne, provoking laughter around the table. But behind the joke, everyone recognized the seed of a viable idea. The fifth important event occurred when they formally decided to establish Miracle Nursery, named in honor of the dog that had been in many ways the catalyst for this entire rebirth. The transformation was not limited to the practical aspects of their lives. There were more subtle but equally profound changes in the relationships between them. Sarah, who had always maintained a certain emotional distance from her mother, began to open up, sharing fears and hopes during long nighttime conversations. Mrs. Vance, in turn, found the courage to talk about issues she had kept silent for years. Her grief over Humberto, her feelings of abandonment when Sarah moved away, her growing affection for Mr. Hawthorne. I never thought I could feel something like this again at my age, she confessed one night, as they both folded freshly washed clothes. I feel almost ridiculous, like a teenager. Sarah smiled, surprising her mother by taking her hand affectionately. Love doesn't have an expiration date, Mom, and you deserve to be happy, after everything you've been through. As for Mr. Hawthorne and Mrs. Vance, their relationship evolved at its own pace, without haste or labels. There were knowing glances, hands that occasionally met while working in the garden, a trust that went beyond words. They didn't need to define what they had. It was enough to live it day by day, aware of the gift it meant to find companionship and understanding in the autumn of their lives. One Sunday afternoon, while the whole family enjoyed an outdoor meal under the shade of the old mango tree, Mr. Hawthorne made an unexpected announcement. I've decided to sell my house in town, he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. I hardly spend any time there anymore, and maintaining 2 properties at my age doesn't make much sense. A surprised silence followed his words. It was Olivia who finally verbalized the question everyone had. Where are you going to live, Mr. Hawthorne? He smiled, his gaze briefly meeting Mrs. Vance's before replying. Well, that depends. There's a small guest house at Willow Creek Farm that's unoccupied. My plan was to renovate it and, if everyone agrees, move in there. That way I'd be closer to the nursery and all of you. The proposal hung in the air like a dandelion seed, delicate but full of possibilities. No one wanted to catch it immediately, allowing each one to consider it at their own pace. That night, while the ranch slept, Mrs. Vance went out to the porch with a cup of chamomile tea. Miracle faithfully followed her, settling at her feet as was his custom. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky, and the scent of night-blooming flowers perfumed the air. She thought about the path that had led her here, the dying dog in an alley, the lonely apartment, the fears that had almost paralyzed her. She thought about her husband, the money he had saved for her, the seeds he had carefully labeled, as if he knew that one day she would return and need them. And she thought about Mr. Hawthorne, his unwavering kindness, his patience, the way he had entered their lives and transformed them without impositions or demands. What do you think, Miracle? She whispered to the dog, who lifted its head at the sound of its name. Is it all right that we build a new family, different but just as real? Miracle didn't answer, of course, but in his bright eyes, Mrs. Vance believed she saw the same message he had given her that first day. Life is too precious to live it in fear. The June sky dawned laden with dark clouds, heralding one of those tropical storms that occasionally swept through the region. Mrs. Vance woke to the distant rumble of thunder and immediately felt a pang of concern for the new seedlings in the nursery, barely protected by a makeshift plastic roof. By the time she was ready, the whole family was already in motion. Sarah, who would normally be getting ready for school, had called to say that classes would be suspended due to the bad weather. Ethan and Mr. Hawthorne had left early to reinforce the nursery structure, while Olivia helped move pots and seed trays to safer locations. "It looks like it's going to be strong," Sarah commented, looking out the kitchen window. "The forecast says it could last all day." Miracle was restless, moving nervously from one side of the house to the other. Like many dogs, he had a special sensitivity to atmospheric changes, and storms made him particularly anxious. "Easy, buddy," Mrs. Vance comforted him, stroking his head. "We're safe here." But as the morning progressed, the storm gained intensity. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches and tearing leaves. The rain, at first a gentle drumming, transformed into a furious curtain that pounded against the windows like angry little fists. The creek that ran through the property, normally a gentle, crystalline stream, began to rise, its waters turning murky and swift. When Mr. Hawthorne and Ethan returned to the house, they were soaked despite their raincoats. They had managed to secure the nursery as best they could, but both showed concern on their faces. "The main road is starting to flood," Mr. Hawthorne reported, gratefully accepting the towel Mrs. Vance offered him. "If it continues like this, we'll soon be cut off." The news brought with it the fifth medium hurdle. Sarah immediately thought of Miracle's medication. There was very little left, and they had planned to go to town the next day to replenish it. If the road was blocked for several days, as had happened in other similar storms, the dog could run out of his vital treatment. "Maybe I should try to get to town now before it gets worse," suggested Mr. Hawthorne, looking out the window at the road that was gradually disappearing under the water. "It's too dangerous," Mrs. Vance objected, the worry evident in her voice. "The currents in the low-lying areas can be treacherous." "I've known this land since I was a child," he insisted with a reassuring smile. "I know which routes to take to avoid the lowest areas. Besides, I have to make sure my house in town is all right. I'll kill two birds with one stone." Despite everyone's protests, Mr. Hawthorne remained firm in his decision. He promised to be extremely cautious and return as soon as possible with the medication. Before leaving, he bent down to pet Miracle, who looked at him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than a dog normally should. "Take care of everyone while I'm gone, buddy," he said softly. "Especially your owner." The following hours were filled with growing anxiety. The storm intensified, turning into a real deluge. The electricity failed in the mid-afternoon, leaving them with candles and flashlights as their only sources of light. Mr. Hawthorne's phone wasn't answering, probably out of range due to the storm. Ethan tried to keep everyone distracted by organizing board games by candlelight. Olivia took charge of preparing sandwiches for dinner, as cooking was impossible without electricity. Sarah constantly checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was well sealed against the rain that seemed to want to enter through any crack. Mrs. Vance, sitting by the window with Miracle curled up at her feet, kept her eyes fixed on the driveway, increasingly less visible under the curtain of water. She couldn't help but remember another storm years ago, when Humberto had gone out similarly to help a neighbor and had returned with pneumonia that eventually complicated his already fragile health. "He'll be back, Mum," Sarah said, sitting next to her and taking her hand. "Mr. Hawthorne is a cautious man." "I know," Mrs. Vance replied, squeezing her daughter's hand. "But fear doesn't always listen to reason." It was around midnight when they heard the sound of an approaching engine. Miracle was the first to react, jumping up and running to the door, barking enthusiastically. Ethan, who had fallen asleep on the armchair, woke up startled and ran to open it, holding a flashlight. There was Mr. Hawthorne, soaked, covered in mud, but smiling. In his hands he carried a plastic bag protected inside his jacket, Miracle's medication. The relief Mrs. Vance felt was so intense that her legs almost gave way. She found herself moving towards him without thinking, and before she could process what she was doing, she hugged him tightly, not caring about the water or the mud. "You're crazy, you stubborn old man," she murmured against his shoulder. "You could have stayed in town." "And leave you here worrying all night? Not a chance," he replied, returning the hug. That spontaneous moment, born of concern and relief, marked a new chapter in their relationship. It had broken down barriers of reserve and formality that both, raised in a more traditional generation, had maintained until then. The storm continued throughout the night, but inside the house, something had changed. A feeling of unity, of true family, had solidified. Sarah made hot coffee for everyone while Olivia and Ethan helped Mr. Hawthorne dry off and change. Miracle didn't leave his side, as if understanding the effort he had made for his well-being. The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Parts of the ranch were flooded, the creek had overflowed in some sections, and several trees showed broken branches, but the house was still standing, solid, and the nursery, thanks to the precautions taken, had suffered minimal damage. While assessing the effects of the storm, they received an unexpected visit. Mr. Davis, the town carpenter, arrived in his pickup truck, bringing worrying news. Mr. Hawthorne's house in town had suffered significant damage. A tree had fallen on the roof, causing serious leaks. "It's going to need extensive repairs," Mr. Davis explained. "The water has already damaged part of the ceiling and walls." This news constituted the fourth major hurdle. The house, which Mr. Hawthorne planned to sell, would now require a considerable investment before it could be put on the market. Money they didn't have earmarked for that purpose, especially with everything invested in the nursery and the restoration of the ranch. While discussing their options in the kitchen, Olivia surprised everyone with a suggestion. "What if we sell online? The plants, I mean. We already have the photos I took. Ethan can create a basic website, and we could ship plants to the city. I've seen how much they pay there for native and organic plants." The idea, which had previously been mentioned as a future possibility, suddenly seemed like an immediate solution. With renewed determination, the family organized themselves. Sarah would use her contacts in the city to promote the business. Ethan and Olivia would handle the digital side. Mr. Hawthorne would contribute his knowledge of plants. And Mrs. Vance would oversee the quality of everything that came out of the nursery. "Miracle Nursery started as an emergency," Mrs. Vance said, stroking the dog, who seemed to understand that they were talking about him. "And now, it could be our salvation." Again. The following weeks were filled with intense work. Mr. Hawthorne's house in town was temporarily secured against further damage, while he officially moved to the ranch, occupying a room that Sarah and the children insisted on giving him. The guest house, which would eventually be his permanent residence, would need work before it was habitable. The online business took off with surprising speed. Olivia's artistic photographs, combined with the detailed descriptions Ethan wrote based on Humberto's notes, and Mr. Hawthorne's knowledge, attracted city customers eager for native and organically grown medicinal plants. In less than a month, Miracle Nursery had generated enough income to cover some of the necessary repairs to Mr. Hawthorne's house. What had started as a response to an emergency was becoming a viable family business, connecting ancestral knowledge with modern needs. "I never thought that at my age I'd be selling plants online," Mrs. Vance commented, as she carefully packed some peppermint cuttings to ship to the city. "And I never imagined my mum would be a digital entrepreneur," Sarah replied with a smile, helping her seal the boxes. The sixth important event came when the school where Sarah worked organized an educational visit to the ranch. The principal, impressed by the stories Sarah told about the family nursery, proposed incorporating the place as a living laboratory for natural science classes. Students could learn about botany, local ecosystems, and sustainability firsthand. The first school visit transformed the ranch into a bustling space of curious children running around, asking questions, touching plants, marveling at the variety of species growing there. Miracle, to everyone's surprise, showed infinite patience with the little visitors, allowing them to pet him and following them around the garden like a watchful guardian. Mr. Hawthorne revealed a natural talent for teaching, explaining to the children how to identify medicinal plants, how the water cycle works in a natural environment, why it's important to preserve native species. His calm voice and simple explanations kept the students captivated. "You should have been a teacher," Mrs. Vance commented that night as they rested on the porch after the exhausting day. "Maybe I am now," he replied with a smile. "Say it's never too late to find a new vocation." That phrase resonated deeply with all of them. At different ages and through different circumstances, each member of this makeshift family had found a new direction, a renewed purpose, precisely when they least expected it. Autumn arrived, painting the ranch landscape in ochres and golds. A little over a year had passed since Mrs. Vance found Miracle in that alley, a year of transformations that no one could have predicted. The house shone completely restored. The nursery thrived with permanent structures that had replaced the makeshift sheds, and the family orchard produced more than they could consume, allowing them to share with neighbors and sell the surplus. The guest house had also been renovated, although Mr. Hawthorne rarely used it. Without anyone saying it explicitly, it had become more of a space for occasional visitors or for when Sarah needed to work late on lesson plans. The room he initially occupied temporarily in the main house had in practice become his permanent residence. It was Sunday, and as had become tradition, the whole family was gathered for dinner. Ethan, now in his senior year of high school, spoke enthusiastically about his plans to study agronomy at the State University, close enough to continue helping at the nursery on weekends. Olivia, 2 years younger, already showed talent as a photographer and had started receiving small commissions for local events, inspired by the success of her photographs for the family business. Sarah, more relaxed and happy than she had been in years, shared anecdotes about her students while serving chicken and rice, a recipe her mother had taught her and that she had finally mastered. Teaching, which she had initially accepted as a temporary job, had become a true vocation that filled her with satisfaction. Miracle, now a healthy dog although always small, moved between the chairs receiving pats and occasional treats that everyone gave him, despite Mrs. Vance's protests about not spoiling him. His heart condition, well controlled with regular medication, didn't prevent him from enjoying a full and active life. It was during dessert that Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat, catching everyone's attention. "I have something to share with you," he announced, his voice slightly trembling. "After much thought, I made a decision about my house in town. I sold it yesterday." The news didn't really surprise anyone. After the repairs, he had put the property up for sale, but the announcement that it had finally been finalized brought an air of formality to what everyone already knew. Mr. Hawthorne had found his home here, with them. "There's something else," he continued, taking a small box out of his pocket. "Mrs. Vance, we've come a long way together this year. We started as 2 lonely old people united by a dog in need, and now I can't imagine my life without you." An expectant silence fell over the table. Olivia and Ethan exchanged knowing glances, while Sarah watched her mother with a mixture of tenderness and emotion. "I'm not proposing anything hasty," Mr. Hawthorne clarified with a smile. "At our age, we've lived enough to know that every day is precious. What I want to offer you is a symbol of my commitment, a promise to share the days we have left, whether many or few." He opened the small box, revealing a simple but beautiful ring with a blue stone that caught the afternoon sunlight. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment, and I think that moment is now." Mrs. Vance, normally so eloquent, found herself speechless. Her eyes shone with unshed tears as she looked at the man who, almost without realizing it, had become an essential part of her life. "What do you say?" Mr. Hawthorne asked, turning to Sarah and her children with a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Would you officially accept me as part of this family?" It was Ethan who answered first, with the frankness characteristic of his youth. "Mr. Hawthorne, you've been part of this family for a long time. The ring just makes it official for the rest of the world." Olivia nodded enthusiastically, and Sarah, with tears in her eyes, simply got up to hug the man who had brought so much joy and stability to their lives. "And you, Miracle?" Mr. Hawthorne asked the dog, who was watching him intently. "Do you give me your blessing?" As if he understood perfectly what was happening, Miracle approached, put his front paws on Mr. Hawthorne's knee and barked once decisively, before turning towards Mrs. Vance as if saying, "Your turn." Amidst laughter and tears, Mrs. Vance finally found her voice. "When I gave you shelter, little Miracle," she said, stroking the dog's head, "I never imagined you were giving me so much more in return. You gave me back not only the home I had abandoned, but the ability to open my heart again." Then, looking directly at Mr. Hawthorne, with a smile that lit up her entire face, she added, "And yes, I accept your symbol and your promise, because there's no better way to honor the past than to dare to build a new future." The ring found its place on her finger, a little loose but perfect in its meaning. They didn't need a formal ceremony or official papers. What they shared transcended those formalities. It was a commitment born of maturity, of the deep knowledge that life is unpredictable but infinitely richer when shared. That night, as the full moon bathed the ranch in its silvery light, Mrs. Vance went out to the porch, as she had so many times before. Mr. Hawthorne followed her silently, bringing 2 cups of hot chocolate. Miracle, faithful as ever, settled between them. "What are you thinking about?" Mr. Hawthorne asked, handing her a cup. "About the paths that brought us here," she replied, her gaze lost on the horizon where the outlines of the trees were drawn against the starry sky. "How sometimes we have to lose something to find something new. How an abandoned little dog can change so many lives at once." Mr. Hawthorne nodded, perfectly understanding the thread of her thoughts. "I wonder if Humberto would be happy with all this." Mrs. Vance smiled serenely. "I'm sure he would. He always said that true love wants us to keep loving, even when it's no longer there." They remained silent for a while, enjoying the peace of the night and the warmth of their mutual company. In the distance, the sound of the creek mingling with the gentle rustle of the leaves created a melody that seemed to be the very heartbeat of the earth. "You know what's the most beautiful thing about all this?" Mrs. Vance finally said. "That when I thought my life was ending, it was actually starting a new chapter. That it's never too late to find purpose, love, family." Mr. Hawthorne took her hand, the one now wearing his mother's ring, and kissed it reverently. "That's the lesson Miracle taught us all," he replied. "That even at our darkest moment, when we give up and close our eyes to the cold, a warm shawl can appear to wrap us. And that sometimes, that shawl that saves us comes from where we least expect it." Miracle, as if understanding that they were talking about him, lifted his head and looked at his 2 humans with those eyes that no longer showed resignation or fear, but love and belonging. Somewhere in the universe, among the constellations that shone above them, perhaps there was a plan, a purpose for their seemingly chance encounters, or perhaps not. Perhaps the real magic was simply in the decisions they made each day. The decision to stop in an alley, to open the door to a stranger, to return home, to face fears, to allow themselves to love again. As the ranch slept under the protective cloak of night, this unlikely family, united by choices rather than blood, represented a silent reminder that forgotten paths sometimes lead us exactly where we need to be, and that it's never too late to hear their whisper. My friends, we've reached the end of the story. Did you enjoy it? What lesson can you take from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. Until next time.